When I saw my husband standing by the window, holding the folded letter in his hand, my breath caught, not because I feared what he might say, but because I knew exactly what that letter meant. It wasn't a bill or some advertisement, it was the one I had written weeks ago and never meant for anyone to see. I had hidden it inside an old recipe book, thinking it would stay buried there forever. But there he was, reading the lines I'd written in the quiet of sleepless nights, the ones I never dared to speak aloud. I watched his expression shift as his eyes moved across each sentence, his brow tightening, his jaw stiffening. My pulse hammered so loudly I thought he might hear it. He didn't ask me anything at first. He just kept reading. And I stood there, frozen, feeling like every secret I'd tried to bury was clawing its way to the surface. That letter didn't tell the whole story. It only hinted at what had been simmering under the surface, behind polite dinners and shared calendars. My husband's fingers trembled slightly as he turned to the second page, and I knew, if he kept reading, he would get to the part one could never explain, the part that would unravel everything. The silence between us grew so heavy it felt like another person in the room. Then the sound of footsteps upstairs shattered it. He didn't move, didn't look away, but I saw the realization flicker in his eyes. I bit down on the inside of my cheek, an old habit when nerves tangled with fear, and tasted the faintest trace of blood. My heart raced as I tried to think, tried to form an excuse that didn't sound like an excuse. But it was already too late. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind of mistake that changes absolutely everything, and now, let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the truth I've been hiding for so long, tell me in the comments what city you're watching this from, and answer me honestly, have you ever kept a secret so heavy you knew, one day, it would find its way into the light? There are mornings when the house feels like a museum, and I am its only visitor. The walls carry the weight of decades, the photos on the shelves still smiling like nothing ever changed, and yet the air is hollow. My husband and I have lived here for years, longer than I care to count, but somewhere along the way, the warmth bled out of the rooms. We share meals, we share a bed, but we no longer share the quiet joy of simply being together. He reads the news on his phone while we eat. I sip my coffee and pretend the silence doesn't bother me. But it does. It eats at me, in ways I couldn't admit, not even to myself. He is not unkind. That would have been easier, perhaps. No, he is gentle, polite even, but distant. His affection has grown practical, almost transactional, a coat draped over my shoulders on a cold day, a reminder to take my pills when I forget. And yet, when his hand brushes mine, there's nothing there anymore. No spark, no lingering glance, just the faintest pressure and then absence. I don't think he even notices it's gone. I do. I notice it every day. It was his idea for his grandson to stay with us, well, his grandson in name, though not by blood. The boy, already a man, really, had nowhere else to go for a few months. Just until he gets back on his feet, my husband said, folding his newspaper with that same dry finality he uses for every decision. I didn't protest. Why would I? I thought it might even be nice to have another presence in the house, to hear footsteps on the stairs that weren't just my own. I didn't know then how those footsteps would echo. When he arrived, the house changed instantly. It wasn't anything dramatic, just little things. The creak of the stairs in the late morning when he came down for breakfast. The way the kettle whistled louder when someone else was there to hear it. Even his humming in the kitchen felt like a thread pulling something forgotten inside me back to life. He carried his bags upstairs without a word, polite, quiet, careful not to intrude. And yet, I felt his presence everywhere. I noticed him noticing me. Not in a way that startled me, not at first. It was just an awareness, his eyes following me when I reached for a cup on the highest shelf, or when I brushed my hair back in the hall mirror. It shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. Because it had been years since I'd felt that kind of gaze on me. Not from my husband, not from anyone. It wasn't bold or crude, it wasn't even fully intentional, but it was there. And it woke something in me I thought had gone quiet forever. I remember the first evening, the three of us at the dinner table. My husband scrolled through his phone between bites of soup. I asked questions, about school, about work, about the city he'd left behind, and he answered softly, his voice steady, his eyes meeting mine longer than they needed to. It was nothing inappropriate. Nothing you could name. But I felt it. Like an ember in a cold fireplace, a faint heat I hadn't felt in years. At night, I lay awake and listened to the house. The refrigerator humming. The wind slipping past the shutters. And, faintly, the sound of him padding down the stairs, opening the kitchen cupboard for a glass of water. I turned on my side and told myself not to think about it. But I did. Because in that moment, the house didn't feel like a museum anymore. It felt alive. I didn't understand, not yet, what that meant for me, or for any of us. But that was the beginning. And the beginning is always quieter than you think. The second week passed more slowly, the air in the house thick with a strange new energy I couldn't name. My husband's schedule grew even more scattered, meetings, errands, the occasional dinner he couldn't miss. It was nothing unusual, not really. He'd been like that for years, slipping into routines that kept him away from home. And yet, now, his absence felt different. It wasn't just empty, it was an opening. It happened one quiet evening. The kind where the house feels smaller because you hear everything. I had been feeling a dull ache in my back all day, the kind that creeps up when you've been bending and stretching, pulling weeds in the garden and sorting the endless clutter my husband always promises he'll help with but never does. When I sat down at the kitchen table that night, the ache made me wince. I rubbed my shoulder absent-mindedly, thinking aloud more than complaining, I've been sore all day. He looked up from the tea he was pouring for himself, his voice soft but steady. Do you want me to help? Just a quick massage, nothing serious. I hesitated. My husband was upstairs, half watching the news on his tablet, half dozing like always. He had heard the comment, I'm sure, but didn't even look up to offer help. That fact stung more than I admitted to myself, but I smiled politely anyway and said, all right, just for a minute. I don't know what I expected. Maybe something perfunctory, clumsy pats, an awkward tap on the shoulders. Instead, when he stood behind me and placed his hands on my back, it was careful, almost tentative. His palms were warm through the thin fabric of my sweater, the pressure light at first, almost formal. The smell of lavender drifted faintly from the candle I'd lit hours ago on the counter. It was one of those little things I did for myself, a habit my husband barely noticed. But now the scent mixed with something new, the sound of his quiet breathing behind me, the way his fingers pressed just firmly enough to ease the tension that had settled between my shoulder blades. I told myself not to think of it as anything more than what it was. A simple kindness. A helping hand. And yet, the longer he worked, the more I became aware of my own heartbeat, the way my body responded to being noticed, being cared for in a way that felt almost forgotten. The kitchen was silent except for the creak of the chair and the occasional shift of his weight. My husband's muted voice drifted down from upstairs, talking back to a news anchor, oblivious. And here, in this small circle of warmth, I felt something I hadn't in years, awake. His hands moved with more confidence now, the hesitation fading. He found a knot at the base of my neck and pressed into it, and I let out a sound that surprised me, a sigh, almost a whisper. I bit my lip, embarrassed, but he didn't comment, didn't laugh. He just continued, quietly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When I turned my head slightly, meaning only to thank him, our eyes met. The reflection caught us both in the window above the sink, me in the chair, him standing close behind, his hands still resting on my shoulders. For a second, neither of us moved. It would have been easy to pull away then. To break the silence with some polite, dismissive remark, "That's enough, thank you," or "I feel better now." But I didn't say those things. Neither did he. We kissed. Just that. Nothing more. And yet, in that moment, the house seemed to change shape. We didn't speak of it afterward. The silence stretched, and we both let it. He stepped back, picked up his tea, and left the kitchen with the same quietness he'd entered. I sat there for a long time, my back no longer aching, my breath shallow and uneven. When my husband finally came downstairs for a glass of water, I forced myself to smile as if nothing had happened. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled when I passed him the glass. That night, lying in bed beside the man I had been married to for decades, I stared at the ceiling. He fell asleep quickly, like always, his breathing deep and even. I listened to it and felt an ache I couldn't explain, not the ache in my back, but somewhere deeper, somewhere I hadn't touched in years. I didn't know what this meant yet. I didn't know what it would become. But I knew something had shifted, and there was no undoing it. The following days dragged by with a strange weight, like time itself had thickened. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, no confrontations, no conversations about what had passed between us in that quiet kitchen, but the silence held something unspoken, and I felt it in every movement, every glance. I threw myself into chores as if that could erase the memory. I scrubbed the counters until they gleamed, sorted through old drawers full of forgotten receipts and faded photographs, rearranged the pantry shelves even though they didn't need it. But the more I tried to busy myself, the more those moments returned, clear as glass. The warmth of his hands on my back. The way his eyes had met mine in the reflection, unflinching. That single, undeniable kiss. I told myself it had been an impulse, something fleeting, meaningless, a kindness that tipped, for just one moment, into something it shouldn't have been. But each time I looked in the mirror, I saw something different in my own face. Not guilt, not exactly, but awareness. He was careful after that night. Not distant, no, that would have been easier, but careful. He didn't avoid me, and he didn't look away when our eyes met. He simply carried on, calm, composed, as though nothing between us had changed, though every breath in that house said otherwise. I think he knew I needed that calmness. Maybe he understood better than I did that anything overt would have broken the fragile balance we were still pretending to hold. 2 days after the kiss, I offered to drive him into town. It wasn't planned. He'd mentioned he needed a few things, a book, some papers, something trivial, and before I even thought about it, I heard myself saying, "I'll take you." The drive was uneventful at first, the kind of small-town journey where every landmark feels familiar. The gas station that hadn't changed its sign in 20 years. The row of faded shops with windows that always seemed half empty. But in the car, the silence was different from the silence in the house. There was no sound of a television upstairs, no footsteps of my husband moving around, no buffer. Just the hum of the engine and the road stretching ahead of us. We talked, but lightly. He asked about the old bakery on Main Street. I told him how it used to sell the best apple pies before the owner passed away. He mentioned the school he'd left behind, his voice tinged with something that sounded like nostalgia, or maybe regret. I told him about the town library, how it still smelled of paper and dust the same way it did when I was young. None of it was intimate. None of it crossed any lines. But the way he listened, it was so rare, that simple, complete attention. When my husband listens, his mind is always somewhere else, on emails, on bills, on things I can't see but can feel pulling him away. But in that car, for those miles, I felt heard. When we stopped at a small shop for groceries, we ran into someone I hadn't seen in years, an old friend of my husband's, a woman who has always had that sharp, knowing gaze. She greeted me warmly, too warmly, her eyes flicking between us. She asked how my husband was, why he wasn't there. I smiled, made a joke, said something vague about him being as busy as ever. Her smile didn't falter, but her look lingered. I felt heat rise to my cheeks as I loaded the bag of bread and milk into the cart, though she hadn't said anything at all. It was as if she could see something in the space between us, something I wasn't ready to admit even to myself. On the way back, the mood shifted just slightly. He didn't say much, and I didn't push. The car filled with the soft sound of the radio, an old song I hadn't heard in years drifting through the speakers. When we pulled into the driveway, my husband's car wasn't there. He had gone out, another dinner, another meeting. I couldn't even remember which excuse he had given this time. The absence felt heavier now, like a gap we weren't supposed to notice but couldn't ignore. Inside, I busied myself with putting the groceries away, one item at a time, as though stretching the task might stretch the evening. He reached to help, placing things on the counter, moving close enough that his sleeve brushed against mine. It was nothing. Just an accident. But I felt it like an electric spark under my skin. I thought of that friend's look at the shop, the way her eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly, and I felt my heart race, not out of fear, but because I knew she wasn't wrong. Something was shifting, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. That night, I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the photo on the nightstand, me and my husband at a picnic decades ago. His arm draped over my shoulder, his smile wide and easy. I ran my fingers along the frame, trying to summon that same warmth, that same sense of being cherished. But all I could feel was the ghost of another touch, another presence, and the way my heart had sped up when his sleeve brushed mine. I told myself to stop. To draw the line before it was too late. But I already knew. Lines drawn in your mind are easier to cross than you think. The day my husband left for his short business trip, the house shifted again, though no furniture moved and no doors slammed. It was subtler than that, like the air itself changed. He left early, his suitcase neatly packed, his goodbye perfunctory. A quick peck on the cheek, a reminder about watering the plants, the faint sound of the car pulling away down the street. There had been dozens of trips like this before, and yet this one felt different. I stood by the window after he left, holding my coffee but not drinking it, staring at the driveway long after the car had disappeared. The silence that followed wasn't the usual quiet I'd grown used to. It wasn't the kind that weighed you down, it was the kind that hummed. I went through the motions of my day, making lists, folding laundry, moving through the rooms of the house like a shadow of myself, but everything felt charged. His things were still there, his glasses on the nightstand, his slippers by the door, his scent faint on the jacket hanging over the chair. And yet, his absence made space for something else. By late morning, I found myself in the hallway closet, pulling out boxes I hadn't touched in years. Old linens, and used vases, stacks of photos in yellowing envelopes. It was an excuse more than a chore, a reason to keep moving. He came down the stairs when he heard me struggling with a heavy box, offering to help without hesitation. It was such a simple moment, his hands brushing mine as we steadied the box together, but it lingered in my mind long after. The day unfolded slowly. We made lunch in the kitchen, side by side, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I sliced tomatoes while he rinsed dishes, the small sounds of water and knives against cutting boards filling the space. At one point, I noticed his book on the counter, left open to a page marked with a folded receipt. I glanced at it while he turned to grab something from the pantry. A novel, nothing remarkable, but there was a line underlined in pencil, asterisk, some silences are louder than words. Asterisk. I traced the underlined words with my eyes and felt them settle into me. That afternoon, I asked for help with a shelf in the back room, a small, stubborn thing that had been leaning for months. My husband had promised to fix it but never found the time. He followed me in without question, sleeves rolled up, ready to hold the wood steady while I searched for the right screws. The room was cramped, the shelf pressed against the wall in a way that forced us closer. I could smell the faint soap from his earlier shower, the way the dust in the air caught the afternoon light. We joked about how uneven the wall was, his laughter low and easy, and for the first time in years, I laughed too, not out of politeness, but because I wanted to. It was a small sound, but it startled me, hearing it come from my own mouth. We worked in a rhythm, with me holding nails, him hammering, both of us leaning in, our hands brushing as we passed tools back and forth. Nothing about it was planned, and yet there was a softness in those moments, the kind you almost miss if you're not paying attention. Later, when the shelf finally stood firm against the wall, we stepped back to admire it, standing so close our shoulders touched. He smiled, and it wasn't the fleeting, half-there smile people give when they're distracted. It was warm. Present. The knock on the door came just then, sharp, unexpected. I wiped my hands on a rag and opened it to find our neighbor standing there, holding a pair of garden shears. She asked to borrow them, her voice polite, but her eyes darted past me into the house. Her gaze lingered for just a fraction longer than it should have, flicking from me to him, taking in the way we stood side by side, the faint dust on our clothes, the way we moved slightly apart when she stepped in. It was nothing she said, it was the look. I handed her the shears with a smile, casual and light, as if I didn't feel the weight of her observation. She thanked me and left, but the trace of her glance stayed behind, an echo in the air long after the door closed. The evening came on quietly, the sky bruising into twilight. He made tea, and we sat at the table with the mugs between us, not talking much, not needing to. Every small sound, the clink of ceramic, the rustle of pages as he turned a corner of his book, felt magnified. I should have felt guilty. That would have been the natural thing, wouldn't it? To feel shame creeping in with the quiet, to tell myself this wasn't right. And yet, what I felt was something different. I felt alive. When night finally came, I lingered downstairs longer than usual, pretending to tidy up, adjusting the cushions on the sofa that didn't need adjusting. Upstairs, the bed waited, cold and familiar. But I wasn't ready to climb those steps yet. I could hear him moving in his room, the faint shuffle of papers, the creak of his chair. The house felt different with just the two of us awake in it. Different, but not wrong. I turned off the last light in the living room, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway. Then I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence between rooms, the silence that wasn't empty at all. The morning after the neighbor's visit began like any other, though I noticed the way I moved through the house was different. I woke earlier than usual, before the sunlight fully touched the curtains, and for a moment I just lay there, listening. I heard the faint creak of the stairs, a cupboard opening, the low hum of the kettle. He was in the kitchen, already awake. I told myself to stay upstairs, to let him have his morning without interruption, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself following those sounds, drawn to them like they carried some quiet promise. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast when I stepped in. He looked up briefly, offering a small smile, and slid a mug across the counter toward me. The day unfolded slowly, stretching out like a ribbon. My husband had called late the night before, a quick, distracted conversation. He'd be gone longer than planned, just another day or two. He didn't sound suspicious or even particularly curious. He trusted me. That thought lodged itself deep, uncomfortable but undeniable. By mid-morning, we were both in the living room. I was flipping through an old magazine, not reading, just turning pages to fill the silence. He was sitting on the floor, tying up a loose strap on his bag. It should have been ordinary, forgettable. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. At some point, he stood and looked toward me, almost hesitant. "Your back still hurts?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded without thinking. It was true, the ache hadn't completely gone, though now it felt like an excuse I hadn't meant to invent. He set aside whatever he had been doing, his tone calm, almost casual. "I can show you a stretch. It might help." It was such a simple offer. Innocent on the surface. I agreed just as simply, not looking too closely at why. We cleared a small space on the rug. He demonstrated first, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if to show me there was nothing strange about this. I followed his instructions, awkwardly at first, feeling the pull in my shoulders and lower back. We laughed, just lightly, when I stumbled trying to mimic one of his poses. He steadied me, hands at my elbows, his grip firm but careful. The moment could have ended there. It should have. But it didn't. There was a pause when I straightened up, too close to him, the air between us suddenly charged. I looked at him, saw the flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. My breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition of what we were both holding back. We kissed. Just that. And it was enough. When we broke apart, I stepped back, my heart pounding. I muttered something about needing water, my voice too steady to sound natural. He didn't press, didn't say anything. He only nodded, that same measured calmness in his face, though his eyes betrayed something else entirely. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I made lunch and we ate quietly, either of us looking too long at the other. The kiss hung between us like an object on a shelf, untouched, unmentioned, but impossible to ignore. In the late afternoon, I went upstairs to fold laundry. My husband's shirts, neatly stacked, felt heavier in my hands. I ran my fingers over the fabric, imagining him wearing them, imagining the years of our marriage stitched into every seam. I felt the familiar pull of guilt, the ache of knowing I was crossing lines that weren't mine to erase. But alongside the guilt, there was something else, an undeniable current of longing I hadn't felt in so long I barely recognized it. When I came back downstairs, he was sitting at the table, reading. He looked up, and for a brief second, there was no mask between us. The weight of what we'd done, the danger of it, the pull of it, it was all there, visible in a single glance. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband's empty pillow. His absence had always been ordinary before, the kind of absence you learn to live with. Now it felt sharper. I stared at the ceiling and thought of the kiss, the second one, and the way it hadn't felt like a mistake, not really. It had felt inevitable. I didn't close my eyes for a long time. The morning my husband returned felt like the walls of the house had pulled back in on themselves. I woke up before his car even pulled into the driveway, before the crunch of tires on gravel, before the thud of his suitcase landing in the hallway. It was an instinct, the way you wake when something heavy is about to shift. When I heard the door open, I stayed on the stairs for a moment, hidden from view. His familiar sounds filled the space, the rustle of his coat, the click of his shoes on the floorboards, the sigh he always made when he came home from a trip. Ordinary sounds, but they felt different now. I finally stepped into the kitchen. He looked tired, his eyes lined in that way they always are after travel, but there was something else, too, something unreadable, like he was trying to measure the room. He greeted me, kissed my cheek briefly, and set his bag down by the table. Breakfast passed with the strange stiffness of people trying too hard to seem normal. He asked about the garden, about whether I'd managed to take the garbage out on Tuesday, about trivial things that didn't matter. I answered, careful and neutral. But there was a shadow in his voice, a small pause between sentences, like he was hearing something unspoken. Across the table, I felt another set of eyes on me. He sat there, calm, measured, the same way he had been since the first kiss in the kitchen. He didn't flinch under my husband's questions, didn't fidget, didn't break the silence unless he needed to. But every now and then, his hand brushed mine when he passed the sugar or a napkin, and I felt that same jolt I'd felt so many times before. I thought about pulling my hand away faster, making it look like an accident, but I didn't. The rest of the morning blurred. My husband unpacked in the bedroom, opening drawers, sorting clothes. I lingered downstairs, tidying up things that didn't need tidying, listening for footsteps. Each creak on the stairs made my heart leap, though I couldn't decide if it was dread or anticipation. When lunch came, the three of us sat at the same table, but it felt crowded in a way it hadn't before. Every motion seemed magnified, the clink of a fork against a plate, the scrape of a chair against the floor. I found myself gripping the edge of my napkin, my fingers tightening whenever my husband looked up at me for a second too long. He didn't say anything. Not about me, not about the way the air seemed different, not about the way I avoided his eyes when I spoke. But his silence wasn't empty, it pressed against me harder than any question could. Later that day, he told me he needed to go back out, just for a night or two, he said, to help an old friend with some paperwork. He said it casually, as though it didn't matter, but the words landed strangely. I heard myself ask, which friend, but he only smiled faintly and replied, you wouldn't remember her. He packed a smaller bag this time, just a change of clothes, a toothbrush. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled again. This time, the silence that followed was sharper. I moved slowly through the rooms, feeling the tension in my shoulders with every step. I set down a glass on the counter, wiped a perfectly clean surface, rearranged a vase that didn't need rearranging. He came into the kitchen, standing quietly for a moment before speaking. There was no need for explanations, none had been asked, none would be given, but the air between us felt alive in a way I couldn't ignore. We didn't talk much that evening. We didn't need to. The small things said enough, the way he stayed in the kitchen while I cooked, the way his arm brushed mine as he handed me a spoon, the way we both reached for the same dish towel and hesitated before letting go. Every moment felt like a decision. Every glance like a question we weren't ready to answer. That night, when I finally went upstairs, I paused at the bedroom door. My husband's side of the bed was empty, the sheets smoothed over where he hadn't slept. I stood there for a long time, staring at that empty space. And for the first time, I didn't just feel the absence. I felt the possibility it left behind. The second evening of my husband's absence began with a restlessness I couldn't shake. I wandered the house, moving objects from one place to another without reason, folding a throw blanket over the back of the couch, refilling a vase with water that didn't need it. I was aware of every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the faint rhythm of footsteps upstairs. His footsteps. The sun went down earlier than I expected. By the time I realized, the house had already slipped into that muted twilight, the kind that seems to swallow sound. I made tea just for something to do, the clatter of the kettle sharp in the stillness. He came into the kitchen as the steam rose from the pot, his presence filling the room in a way that made my pulse quicken. We didn't speak much while we drank. Words seemed unnecessary, or maybe too dangerous. Instead, there was the scrape of the chairs on the tile, the small splash of tea into the cups, the simple act of sharing space. I caught myself studying his face when he looked away, the way the lamplight caught on his cheekbone, the faint crease near his brow from where he frowned when reading. These were things I shouldn't have noticed, but I did. And each time my eyes lingered too long, I reminded myself to look down, to look away. After tea, the house settled into its nightly quiet. He went upstairs for a while, and I remained in the living room, picking up a book I wouldn't read, flipping through pages I wouldn't remember. I told myself I should go to bed early, that there was nothing left to do awake. But I didn't move. It was sometime after midnight when I heard him come back down. The floor creaked softly, deliberately. I stayed still, my fingers pressed between pages of a book that no longer mattered, pretending to read as he entered the room. Neither of us spoke at first. There was no need. The air between us felt heavy, charged, like something unspoken had already been decided long before the words could come. He sat down across from me, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth, but not a casual one, more like a question he wasn't asking aloud. I set the book aside. The quiet stretched. It was only when he moved closer, slowly, with a hesitation that wasn't really hesitation at all, that I realized how inevitable this had always been. Every glance, every unspoken moment, every brush of his hand over the last weeks, they had all been steps leading here. When his hand reached for mine, I didn't pull away. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. That night, we spent the night together. Morning came in fragments. I woke to the thin gray light slipping through the curtains, the smell of coffee drifting faintly from the kitchen. For a moment, I didn't move. The house felt altered, as though its walls had absorbed what had happened, as though even they were holding their breath. I sat up slowly, my thoughts heavy but sharp. I felt the weight of what I had done, not in some dramatic, crushing way, but in the simple, undeniable way that comes when you know you've crossed a line you can never uncross. The house was quiet again, but not empty. I could hear him moving around downstairs, the soft clink of cups, the scrape of a chair against the floor. Ordinary sounds, made different now. When I finally went down, he didn't greet me with words, just a nod, a brief glance that held everything neither of us could bring ourselves to say. I poured myself coffee, my hands steady even though my mind wasn't. We sat at the table like any other morning, two people drinking from plain mugs, speaking only about small things, whether there was enough bread left, whether the kettle might need descaling. But beneath every word was the memory of the night, the quiet acknowledgement that nothing about the world was the same anymore. I didn't know how to name what I felt. There was guilt, yes, but also something else, something sharper and more complicated, a sense of life returning to places in me I'd thought had gone numb forever. And for a long time, as I stared at the cooling coffee in my cup, I wondered which feeling would win. The morning after, I found myself listening for every sound, bracing for each creak in the house. My husband's return loomed like a clock ticking in the corner of my mind, and each second felt louder than the last. The routine of the day felt fragile, like a picture frame with a crack running through the glass. I stood in the kitchen, washing the same plate over and over, though it was already clean. My hands moved automatically under the running water, but my mind kept replaying the night before. It wasn't a blur, it was too vivid for that. Every glance, every hesitation, every step had been deliberate, and now, in daylight, it felt sharper, not softened. He came into the room quietly. His presence didn't startle me, but it unsettled something inside me. There was no awkwardness between us, not the kind you might expect. There was only a strange stillness, as though both of us knew that speaking too much would tip everything over. The house felt suspended in that stillness all day. I swept the floors though they didn't need sweeping, rearranged jars in the pantry, adjusted the curtains in the living room. Every chore felt like a delay, a way to fill space while I tried to quiet my thoughts. By late afternoon, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel outside. My husband's car. The sound that always used to mean safety, or at least stability. Now it meant something different. I stayed very still, hands pressed flat on the kitchen counter, listening as the front door opened. He called out my name as he always did when he came home, his voice calm, almost cheerful. I turned slowly when he stepped into the kitchen. He looked exactly the same as when he left, coat over one arm, the faint smell of travel on him, the usual small complaint about traffic on his lips. But his eyes lingered on me just a little longer than usual. He didn't say anything out of place. He didn't question the neatness of the house, the folded laundry, the half-finished tea still warm on the counter. He just looked. That look was worse than questions. We had dinner, the three of us, sitting around the same table that now felt crowded even though it had always been the same size. My husband talked about his trip, about a conversation with an old colleague, about the rain that followed him on the drive back. I nodded, smiled where I was supposed to, and avoided looking at either of them for too long. But I felt my husband's eyes on me. And when I did look up, I caught a flicker there of curiosity, suspicion, or maybe just the sense that something had shifted. Later, after dinner, he left his bag by the stairs and went to the living room. He sat in his chair with his usual paper, but he wasn't reading. He held the pages open and stared at them without turning. I cleared the dishes, my movements deliberate, careful, almost silent. I didn't want the plates to clatter, didn't want the sound to break the fragile balance hanging over us. When I passed the doorway, I felt his eyes follow me. He didn't speak, but the weight of his silence pressed against my back as I walked by. Upstairs, I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door of our bedroom. It looked exactly as it always had, white paint, slightly worn at the edges, but it felt like the heaviest door in the house. He joined me later, after the television went dark and the newspaper was folded. He didn't ask about my day. He didn't ask about anything. But when he stood close enough for me to smell the faint trace of his cologne, I felt something almost worse than anger. I felt restraint. He didn't confront me. He didn't accuse me. And that made the air between us almost unbearable. I went to bed that night beside him, the space between us on the mattress feeling wider than the whole house. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I didn't know if he knew. I didn't know if he would ever say it aloud. But I knew the silence wouldn't hold forever. The morning after my husband's return was heavy before the sun even rose. I woke to the sound of his breathing beside me, steady but not peaceful. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing against my chest. When he shifted, turning toward me, I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. I wasn't ready to meet his gaze. Not yet. When I finally got out of bed, the house felt smaller, tighter. The walls seemed to hold every unsaid word. My husband sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, the paper spread in front of him. He didn't look up when I came in, not right away. He turned the page slowly, as if the act of reading was the most natural thing in the world. But I could feel his attention, sharp beneath the surface. We moved around each other all morning like strangers trying to remember the steps to an old dance. He set down his cup, I picked up the sugar. He opened a cupboard, I stepped aside. No one bumped into anyone, but every movement was measured, every pause noticeable. I wanted him to speak first. I wanted him to ask something, anything, to break the silence and force it into words. But he didn't. He folded the paper, placed it carefully on the table, and just sat there, watching me clear the plates. Finally, in the quietest voice, he said, "I knew." Those two words landed heavier than if he'd shouted. I froze, my hands still holding a dishcloth, staring at the counter. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. He didn't elaborate right away. He let the silence stretch, as though he wanted me to fill it, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like any words I tried would splinter before they reached the air. When he spoke again, his tone was steady, not angry, not accusatory, just tired. "I knew before I left," he said. "I knew while I was gone." I turned then, slowly, meeting his eyes. They weren't sharp, not like I'd feared. They weren't cruel. They were just worn. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded loosely in front of him. "I didn't ask," he said. "I didn't stop it. Because," he paused, the faintest trace of a bitter smile on his lips. "Because I've been doing the same thing." The words hung there, unreal at first. He explained, not in detail, he didn't need to. He mentioned a woman he'd known for years, someone I vaguely remembered from the edges of old conversations. Someone who understood him, as he put it, though the word felt strange in the room between us. He said it calmly, almost like he was describing someone else's life. No anger. No shame. Just the plain admission of a truth that had been waiting to surface. I sat down across from him because my legs felt too heavy to keep standing. I folded my hands on the table, mirroring his without meaning to. For a long time, we didn't speak. The house was so quiet I could hear the tick of the clock on the wall, the faint buzz of the refrigerator. I thought I might feel anger. Or betrayal. Or something sharp. But what I felt instead was something closer to recognition. Our marriage had been drifting for so long, its foundations slowly cracking while we both looked the other way. He'd found his escape in another woman. I'd found mine here, in this house, with someone who'd arrived by accident. We didn't apologize, not fully. Not for what had happened, not for what hadn't been said. We just sat there, looking at each other, understanding more than either of us could admit. Later that day, I heard the suitcase again. The soft thud of it being pulled out of a closet. The faint rasp of a zipper closing. He was packing. I didn't ask where he was going. He didn't offer. When I passed the doorway of the spare room, I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, folding a shirt with deliberate care. He didn't look up. Downstairs, I found myself standing by the front window, watching as he walked to his car. He placed the suitcase in the trunk, paused for just a moment, then got behind the wheel. The engine started. The car rolled down the driveway. And just like that, the house was quiet again, too quiet, and yet not empty at all. The days after his departure stretched long and uneven, like the road after a storm, intact, but marked. The house felt hollow, yet not in the same way it once had. There was no longer the weight of things unsaid pressing against every wall. Instead, there was the stillness of something finished, even if nothing had been spoken aloud to declare it so. I moved through the room slowly, touching the familiar objects that had built the shape of our life, the framed photographs, the stack of worn cookbooks, the old vase on the mantel that had belonged to his mother. Everything remained exactly where it had always been, and yet it all looked different, as though someone had shifted the light. The first morning, I caught myself reaching for a second coffee cup out of habit, setting it down on the counter before I remembered he wasn't there to drink from it. The cup sat there for hours, untouched, and I left it, as if removing it would feel too much like admitting how empty the house had become. He hadn't said if he was coming back. He hadn't said if he was gone for good. He'd simply packed, quietly, deliberately, and left. No argument. No confrontation. No final words. Just the sound of the car fading down the street. There was no sense of victory in that. No sense of freedom. Just the quiet realization that everything had shifted and there was no map for what came next. I spent those first days in a strange rhythm. I cleaned parts of the house I'd ignored for years, the tops of cabinets, the dusty corners of the attic. I found stacks of forgotten receipts, notes scribbled in margins, a birthday card from him dated a decade ago with handwriting that already looked tired back then. Every chore carried with it a kind of hollow comfort, but it didn't fill the quiet. He moved through the house too, though in a different way. His things were slowly disappearing, one day a jacket gone from the chair, another day a book missing from the shelf. There was no announcement, no conversation about it. The changes were so small, they could almost have gone unnoticed, except I noticed every single one. It would have been easy to pretend nothing had happened, to fall back into the patterns we'd been living in for years. But there was no pretending now. The kiss in the kitchen. The nights. The admission at the table. All of it had cracked the old shell of our lives, and no amount of silence could make it whole again. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the living room gold, I found myself sitting by the window, staring at the empty driveway. I thought about the woman my husband had mentioned, the one he'd been seeing, the one who understood him. I wondered if she knew about me, if she sat at her own window wondering who I was. I also thought about what had happened here, in this house. About the moments that hadn't been planned but had happened all the same. I thought about how I'd felt when I'd heard footsteps on the stairs that first night, and how that feeling had only grown. It struck me then how strange it all was, that I could sit here, surrounded by the same walls, the same photographs, and yet feel like an entirely different version of myself than the one who had stood in this exact spot months ago. The guilt hadn't vanished. It never would, not entirely. It lingered, sharp around the edges, reminding me of every line I had crossed. But alongside it was something else, something I couldn't deny, the knowledge that I had been seen, noticed, alive in a way I hadn't been for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. He was leaving soon too, the grandson, though I'd long stopped thinking of him in those terms. There were bags packed in his room, stacked neatly, as though he wanted to erase his presence carefully, without leaving too much of a mark. We didn't talk about goodbyes. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't even talk much at all. But there was an unspoken understanding that this chapter was ending, that the house would fall back into its quiet when he was gone. On the morning he left, the air was cool and the sky pale. He carried his bags to the door without needing help. I stood there, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, watching him put on his jacket. There were no long speeches, no drawn-out confessions. Just a nod. A brief glance that held everything neither of us could ever put into words. When the door closed behind him, the house fell into silence again. This time, it was the kind of silence that didn't feel like a question. It felt like a period. I spent that evening sitting at the table with the last of the daylight spilling across the floor. I looked at the framed photographs on the wall, the wedding picture, the vacations, the birthdays, and I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel regret, not in the way I thought I would. What I felt was something quieter. I reached for one of the photographs, tracing the frame with my fingers. It was of me and my husband, taken decades ago. We were smiling then, the kind of smile that came easy, the kind you don't think about. I didn't know what our life would look like now. I didn't know if he would come back, or if I wanted him to. But in that silence, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine something different. Not perfect. Not simple. But new. And as the sky outside turned dark, I sat there, hands folded in my lap, and let that thought settle, as quietly as the house itself.